The instant the file was frozen, power shifted. The one who'd controlled every move went silent. The person everyone ignored didn't react at all. No tears, no pleas, just calm. And that's what most people miss. The weakest-looking person isn't always powerless. Sometimes, they're the only one who truly understands how the system works. I grew up in a house that was never loud. No screaming matches, no slammed doors, no obvious villains. From the outside, it probably looked calm, functional, normal, but inside that house, everything was ranked. After the financial collapse hit our family, things shifted quietly. My mother didn't say it out loud, but the pressure changed her. Survival mode kicked in. Stability mattered more than fairness. Predictability mattered more than listening. And that's when roles hardened. Logan became the safe bet. He was confident, talkative, always had an explanation ready before anyone even asked the question. He knew how to fill silence with certainty. If something went wrong, he had a story that sounded reasonable enough to end the conversation. Teachers trusted him. Relatives praised him. My mother leaned toward him without realizing she was leaning at all. If Logan said something happened, it happened that way. If Logan said he had it handled, no one checked. I learned that early. I learned it in small moments. At the dinner table, when he spoke over me and no one noticed. In the car, when he explained my feelings better than I ever could, and my mother nodded like it made sense. In arguments where I hadn't even finished a sentence before the decision was already made, I wasn't punished. I was simply skipped. And over time, I adjusted. I became the kid who didn't cause problems. The one who didn't ask follow-up questions. The one who said it's fine before anyone needed to apologize. People mistake that for weakness, but silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's adaptation. When you grow up in a system where speaking doesn't change the outcome, you stop speaking to win. You start speaking only when it's safe, and when it's never safe, you start watching instead. I watched how decisions were made, who was believed without proof, who needed evidence just to be heard. I noticed how Logan never saved anything because he never had to. Someone always handled it for him. Someone always smoothed things over. I noticed how my mother trusted tone more than facts, confidence more than consistency. So I stopped competing, not because I couldn't, but because I understood the rules better than anyone realized. In families like ours, there's a quiet hierarchy, not written down, not discussed, but everyone feels it. There's the person whose words carry weight, and the person whose words need translation, and the person whose words don't get asked for at all. No one wakes up deciding to create that system. It grows slowly, through convenience, through exhaustion, through the desire to keep things moving without friction, and that's how imbalance survives. Not through cruelty, but through habit. Logan wasn't evil, at least not in the way people imagine villains. He was just practiced. Practiced at being believed. Practiced at letting other people clean up the details. And I was practiced at disappearing when people say, "Why didn't you say something?" They assume silence means absence of thought, absence of awareness, absence of strategy. What they don't see is that silence can be a form of memory. I remembered dates. I remembered emails. I remembered how often explanations changed depending on who was asking. I didn't collect these things to use against anyone. I collected them because somewhere deep down, I understood something my younger self couldn't put into words yet. If the system was ever going to matter, if facts were ever going to count, I needed to know where they were. There's a kind of silence that comes from fear, and then there's a kind that comes from clarity. Mine started as the first, but over time, it became the second. Because when you grow up being underestimated, you learn very quickly where power actually lives. And it's not always with the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's with the person who's been quiet long enough to see the whole pattern. By the time I was 10, I already knew how arguments in our house ended. Not because I lost them, but because I was never allowed to win. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no threats or punishments, just a pattern that repeated often enough to become law. Logan would speak first. He always did. He explained things quickly, confidently, with just enough detail to sound responsible, even when he messed up. His version of events arrived fully formed, polished, reasonable, easy to accept. And the moment his explanation landed, the room shifted. Questions stopped. Decisions got made. The conversation moved on. If I tried to add something after that, it felt like interrupting a conclusion. So I stopped trying. That's the part people don't understand when they ask, "Why didn't you fight back?" Because fighting assumes the system is neutral. Ours wasn't. In our family, truth didn't win arguments. Tone did. Confidence did. Familiarity did. Logan had been trusted for so long that trust stopped needing evidence. It became automatic, reflexive, invisible. If he forgot paperwork, someone fixed it. If he missed a deadline, there was an explanation ready. If he crossed a line, it was reframed as pressure, stress, or bad timing. He wasn't learning accountability. He was learning immunity, and I was learning something else entirely. I learned that silence kept things calm, that not pushing back made life easier for everyone, that asking too many questions made me difficult. So I adapted. I stopped correcting him in front of people. Stopped defending myself mid-conversation. Stopped expecting fairness from discussions that were already decided. Instead, I started noticing details. I noticed how often his stories changed depending on who was listening. I noticed which emails got answered and which ones quietly disappeared. I noticed how documents were handled, where they were stored, and who never bothered to keep copies. I didn't do this consciously. It wasn't a plan. It was survival. When you grow up watching one person get rescued over and over, you internalize a simple rule: don't rely on rescue, rely on memory. People think the golden child is born that way. They're not. They're built through years of small protections that add up, through excuses that feel harmless in the moment, through adults choosing convenience over correction. Every time Logan avoided consequences, he learned that consequences were optional. Every time someone fixed his mistake, he learned that responsibility could be outsourced. And every time I watched that happen, I learned that my role wasn't to speak louder, it was to be prepared for the day when words wouldn't be enough. There's a specific kind of silence that comes from knowing your voice won't be heard. It's not passive, it's observant, calculating, patient in a way people mistake for indifference. That was me. I remembered file names. I remembered dates. I remembered which version of a story was told to which person. I remembered things no one thought mattered, because no one thought I mattered enough to remember them. And Logan didn't notice any of this. Why would he? From his perspective, The system worked. People believed him. Problems went away. Life stayed comfortable. He never needed to look over his shoulder because no one had ever asked him to. What he didn't realize was that comfort dulls awareness. When you're always believed, you stop checking facts. When you're always defended, you stop keeping records. When you've never been challenged, you don't develop the muscle for accountability. That muscle grows under pressure. I had pressure. I had it every time I swallowed a sentence. Every time I watched a decision land without my input. Every time I was told, "We'll talk about it later." And later never came. So I stopped trying to win conversations. I started collecting proof, not to use, just to have. Because deep down, I understood something my younger self couldn't articulate yet. If the day ever came when feelings stopped mattering, when explanations weren't enough, when the system demanded evidence instead of confidence, I wanted to be ready. Silence didn't make me weaker. It trained me. It trained me to see patterns instead of moments, to trust documentation over reassurance, to understand how power actually moves when emotions are taken out of the equation. And while everyone else saw a quiet kid who stayed out of the way, I was learning the most important lesson our family never taught out loud. In a system where fairness is uneven, the person who survives is not the loudest. It's the one who remembers everything. But let me back up to the morning everything went wrong. It was 6:20, and the air inside the terminal felt like recycled winter. Bright lights, hard floors, the kind of place where your voice sounds smaller the second you raise it. We were supposed to be traveling across state lines that day, not for a vacation, not for anything fun. It was a move, a reset, one of those fresh start plans adults make when life starts slipping and they need to feel like they're doing something about it. My mother had been saying that phrase for weeks. Once we're settled, things will be better. Logan loved that plan. He walked through the airport like he owned it, phone in hand, backpack slung over one shoulder, talking fast, joking with the check-in agent like they were old friends. He looked confident in a way that made adults relax. I walked behind them, carrying a small duffel bag that felt too light for how heavy my stomach was. At the counter, my mother handed over a neat stack of papers, IDs, confirmations, the printed itinerary, the kind of documents that make you feel official, like you belong somewhere. Logan stepped in before I could. "Mom, I've got it," he said, reaching for the folder like it was natural, and she let him. That was the first moment something inside me tightened, because Logan didn't keep papers. Logan didn't remember passwords. Logan didn't double-check. Logan had never needed to. He could forget something important and still be treated like the responsible one. I watched him flip through the documents too quickly, like he was performing competence instead of practicing it. I watched his thumb cover a name, then shift, then cover it again. Then he smiled. "Looks good," he said. And my mother nodded, relieved, like she could breathe again. A few minutes later, we reached the security checkpoint. The line was long and loud, shoes on and off, bags on the belt, people arguing with metal detectors like the machines had personal grudges. My mother leaned toward me and said, "Stay close." I did. I stayed close until Logan turned around, looked at me, and said, "Hey, they're checking something with your file. Just step over there for a second. It'll be quicker if you don't crowd us." His voice was calm, helpful, almost protective. And because I'd lived with that voice my whole life, I listened. I stepped to the side. I watched my mother and Logan move forward, their backs turned toward me, and I told myself it was fine. This was normal. Adults handle things. Kids wait. That's what I'd always done. A uniformed employee approached me with a tablet and asked for my ID. I reached into my jacket pocket. Nothing. I checked the other pocket, the duffel bag. The small zipper pouch I kept my chapstick in like that would somehow help. My throat went dry. I had it. I said, but it came out like a question. The employee's expression didn't change. They weren't mean. That was worse. They were professional, distant, like I was a problem they'd solved 100 times before. Your name isn't cleared in the system, they said. I need your identification and your travel authorization. Travel authorization. That phrase should have meant nothing to me. I was a kid, but in that moment, it sounded like a locked door. I'm with my mom, I said. She has my stuff. The employee glanced past me toward the line, where Logan and my mother were already putting their bins on the belt. Do you have a phone number for her? They asked. I did. I dialed. It rang. It rang again. Then voicemail. I dialed again, thumbs shaking, pretending my hands weren't trembling so the employee wouldn't treat me like a lost child. Voicemail. Logan's number. Straight to voicemail. I looked up, and my mother was on the other side of the security gate now, shoes in hand, half turned back, her eyes scanning like she was looking for something. For me, for a second. I felt relief. Then I saw Logan step beside her, lean in, and say something I couldn't hear. My mother's shoulders dropped. Her face changed, not into anger, not into panic, into something softer, into resignation. She looked at the employee near her. She nodded, like the decision had already been explained, like it had already been made logical. Then she turned forward again, and she kept walking. At first, my brain refused to accept it, because there are mistakes, and then there are choices. Adults misplace things. Adults get overwhelmed. Adults miss calls in noisy terminals, but adults do not leave their 14-year-old behind. Not like that. Not when there's paperwork. Not when there's security. Not when the world is full of strangers who don't care if you're scared. I stepped forward, trying to squeeze around the belt barrier, and the employee gently blocked me with one arm. Ma'am, they said, and the word hit me like ice because I wasn't a ma'am. I was a kid. You can't go through until this is resolved. Resolved. Like I was a glitch. Like I was a loose end. I turned back to the glass wall and saw my mother again, farther now, moving with the crowd. She didn't run. She didn't wave me over. She didn't demand they let me through. She didn't even look angry. She looked relieved, like she'd chosen the quieter option, like she'd chosen the path with less hassle. And that was the moment I understood what Logan's gift really was. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't strength. It was his ability to make other people believe that avoiding the hard thing was the reasonable thing. Because in my mother's mind, this wasn't abandonment. This was a small problem Logan promised to handle. Don't worry. I could almost hear him saying, she'll be fine. She just wants attention. She'll figure it out. If we miss this, everything falls apart. And my mother, exhausted and stressed and desperate to believe her life could still be controlled, chose the explanation that required the least confrontation. I stood there with bright lights overhead and strangers rushing past, and my world narrowed down to one brutal question. How could a parent walk away from their child and call it peace? I want you to sit with that for a second, because a lot of people think the line between a bad parent and a tired parent is fuzzy. But there are boundaries that aren't negotiable. You can be overwhelmed. You can be scared. You can be wrong about what happened. But you don't get to leave a child alone in a system built for adults and tell yourself you didn't mean harm. Meaning doesn't change the outcome. A kid with no ID, no access to their own documents, and no adult advocate is not fine. They're vulnerable. And the most terrifying part wasn't the airport. It wasn't the employees or the cold air or the endless announcements echoing off the ceiling. It was the fact that my mother didn't even turn around to make sure I was safe. She just trusted Logan, and she kept walking. And that's when I realized this wasn't a mix-up. This was a decision, and I was the one being left out of it. For the first 30 minutes after they walked away, I kept thinking it would correct itself, like someone would turn around, like my mother would realize what she'd done and come running back, breathless, angry, demanding they let her daughter through. That's what parents do, right? But the terminal didn't pause for my panic. It kept moving. Announcements echoed overhead. Wheels rolled across tile. People laughed into their phones like the world was still normal. And I stood there with nothing in my hands and no adult assigned to my existence. The employee at the checkpoint guided me to a small desk off to the side. Not a scary room, not a jail. Just a little space where problems waited to be sorted out. They gave me a paper cup of water. The cup was so thin it warmed instantly in my palm. "What's your full name?" the employee asked. I answered. They tapped on a keyboard, stared at their screen, then frowned slightly in that neutral, professional way that meant something was wrong, without saying it out loud. "You're not cleared," they said. "I'm with my mom," I repeated, like saying it a third time would make the system understand. They nodded, like they'd heard that exact sentence 1,000 times. "Do you have identification on you?" I did. I said, I think my mom has it, or my brother." That's when the employee asked the question that made my stomach drop. Why would someone else have your ID because I was 14? I didn't have a sophisticated answer. I only had the truth. "Because they always do," I said quietly. They tried calling the number I gave them, then again, then left a message. I watched the screen of their desk phone light up and go dark like a heartbeat. No call back, no response. And that's when a second employee joined us, older, dressed differently, carrying a clipboard like it was part of his body. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look irritated. He looked like someone who believed in procedures more than opinions. He introduced himself in a calm voice, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of an airport. "Thomas Reed," he said. "I'm with the Regional Compliance Office. I was called over because you're a minor traveling without verified documentation." I didn't know what that meant. I only heard the word minor and felt my throat tighten again. He looked at me for a moment, not with pity, not with suspicion, with focus. Then he asked, "Where is your guardian right now?" I pointed toward the security gates. Even though my family was long gone, "He went with her," I said. His eyes flicked briefly to the direction I pointed, then back to me. How long ago I checked the clock on the wall. The hands looked too calm for what was happening in my chest. "About 40 minutes. He nodded once, then asked something I didn't expect. "Do you know why you're not cleared?" "No," I said. I didn't do anything. I'm not asking if you did anything. He replied gently. I'm asking if you know what they put in your file. He didn't say your mom or your brother. He said like there was already a separation between the system and my family's emotions. Like the system didn't care who loved who. It cared what was submitted. The employee beside him turned a screen slightly so Thomas could see it. I watched his face change not into shock, but into concentration. Then he turned back to me. Your travel authorization has been flagged, he said, and your identification is listed as withheld by an accompanying party. Withheld. That word didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a choice. I felt heat rush to my face. Not just fear, something sharper. They took it. I said, Thomas didn't react like I was being dramatic. He didn't say, are you sure? He didn't smile politely and move on. He just asked one question. Who is they? My mom, I said, and the word felt wrong in my mouth. And my brother? Thomas held my gaze for a long second, then nodded slowly, like he was placing a piece into a larger puzzle. Then he asked the question that no adult in my life had ever asked me before. Do you have proof not? Do you want to call them again? Not? Are you sure you didn't lose it? Not. Can you calm down, proof? I swallowed. At home. I whispered. There are emails, paperwork, copies. My grandma. I stopped because I suddenly remembered something important. I wasn't supposed to involve my grandmother. My mom hated when I made things a bigger deal. That thought almost shut me down. It almost pulled me back into my usual role. But Thomas didn't rush me. He waited, pen resting on his clipboard like time belonged to him. So I forced myself to keep going. My grandma keeps copies of everything, I said. She told me to remember where she puts them. In a blue folder, top drawer, left side. It sounded ridiculous out loud, like a kid trying to play detective. But Thomas didn't dismiss it. Good, he said. That's something. Something. For the first time that morning, I felt the ground under me stop shifting. Not because I was safe yet. Not because my family had returned. Not because anyone had apologized. But because a stranger had just done what my own house never did. He treated my words like they mattered if they could be backed by facts. Thomas turned to the employee at the desk. I need the submitted travel documents for this minor, he said. I need the timestamps, the authorizations, and the associated contact details. The employee nodded and started printing. Paper slid out of the printer in slow, steady sheets, and as they stacked, I realized something I'd never been taught at home. In this building, the loudest person didn't automatically win. In this building, confidence wasn't enough. Here, the system didn't care how convincing Logan sounded. It cared what he had filed. It cared what he had touched. It cared what could be traced. Thomas looked back at me. Evelyn, he said, using my name like I was a person, not a problem. I'm going to ask you questions. You're going to answer them as clearly as you can. And we're going to document everything. Document everything. I nodded, even though my hands were shaking, because I understood what he was offering me. Not rescue, not comfort. A process. A way forward that didn't depend on my mother suddenly growing a conscience or my brother suddenly telling the truth. And that was the first time I realized I might not be as trapped as I'd felt 30 minutes ago. Not because someone loved me enough to turn back, but because someone respected the rules enough to stop the lie from moving forward. Once Thomas started documenting things, the room felt different, not calmer, clearer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He just asked questions and waited for answers that could survive being written down. The first thing he pulled up was the system log. Every document submitted for a miner leaves a trail. Time, device, location, name. Even edits that get fixed later don't disappear. They stack, quietly, patiently. Thomas turned the screen slightly so I could see lines of text scrolling past. "This is when your travel file was created," he said. "This is when it was modified. And this," he tapped the screen once, "is when your clearance was restricted." The timestamp was less than 20 minutes before we reached security. 20 minutes. That meant it wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion at the counter. It wasn't a system error. Someone had actively changed my status while standing a few feet away from me. Thomas printed the log and slid it into a folder. Next came the emails. He asked for the contact information of the adult who submitted the travel authorization. When Logan's name appeared on the screen, I felt something inside me tighten again, not fear this time, but recognition. Of course it was him. Thomas opened the email chain slowly, like he was reading a story backward. There were confirmations sent to my mother's inbox, replies sent from Logan's phone, a forwarded message with a short note attached. Handled. Don't worry about it. That note showed up 3 times. Every time my mother had a question, every time something needed clarification, Logan had stepped in, smoothed it over, simplified it. And my mother had let him. Because Logan always sounded confident. Because Logan never looked panicked. Because Logan knew how to tell a story where he was the solution. But stories don't hold up well when you line them up next to data. Thomas highlighted one email in particular. It was sent the night before the trip, just after 11:00 p.m. Logan had written to the authorization office asking for a temporary hold on my clearance due to documentation inconsistencies. That phrase meant nothing on its own. But then Thomas opened the attachment, a scanned copy of my ID, expired, not the current one, not the replacement my grandmother had helped me get weeks earlier, an old version. One Logan shouldn't have had access to unless he'd gone looking for it. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry, because suddenly every little moment from the past few months lined up. The times my mail never arrived, the folder in the cabinet that had been moved, the night I'd seen Logan standing by the printer, flipping pages back into place like nothing happened. Thomas didn't say anything dramatic. He just said, this version was submitted intentionally. That was it. No accusation, no anger, just fact. A few minutes later, his phone rang. He stepped away to answer it, speaking in the same calm tone he'd used with me. Yes, I understand. No, she's safe. We're reviewing the documentation now. When he came back, his expression hadn't changed. That was your mother, he said. My chest tightened. She says there's been a misunderstanding. He continued. She says her son handled the paperwork and she trusted him. I waited for the part where that explanation worked. It never came. Thomas nodded once and added, trust doesn't override responsibility. Then he asked if I was okay staying where I was while he continued the review. I said yes, even though my hands were shaking again, because something important was happening. Logan arrived an hour later, not frantic, not apologetic, annoyed. He walked in like someone who expected the problem to dissolve once he explained himself. He smiled at Thomas. He laughed lightly. He talked fast. "There's been a mix-up," he said. "My sister tends to overreact. I was just trying to make sure everything was clean." Thomas listened without interrupting. Then he opened the folder. He laid out the printed logs, the email chain, the timestamps. He didn't argue with Logan's story. He placed it next to the evidence. "Can you explain why this file was edited from your device?" Thomas asked. Logan blinked. "Well, like I said, there were inconsistencies, and why an expired ID was submitted instead of the updated version issued 6 weeks earlier." Thomas continued. Logan's smile tightened. "I didn't have access to that one." Thomas turned the screen so Logan could see the access log. "Yes, you did," he said, "on 3 separate occasions." Silence filled the room in a way I'd never heard before. Not the silence of being ignored, the silence of a story falling apart. Logan tried again. He talked about stress, about responsibility, about doing what he thought was best. But every sentence he said floated in the air, unsupported. Because Thomas didn't respond to tone. He responded to records. He pulled up a voice memo next. I didn't even remember recording it. But there it was, my voice. Shaky. From weeks earlier. I'd been practicing explaining where my documents were kept. Talking myself through it quietly so I wouldn't forget. Blue folder. Top drawer. Left side. Thomas didn't play the whole thing. He just let the first few seconds run. Then he turned it off. "That establishes prior knowledge," he said, "which contradicts your claim of confusion." Logan opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in my life, he had nothing left to say. Because confidence only works when no one checks, and power only lasts when no one asks for proof. I didn't say a word through any of it. I didn't need to. The system spoke for me, every click, every timestamp, every record that said, quietly but clearly, this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was control, and it was slipping. Thomas closed the folder. "Your sister's travel restriction will remain lifted," he said. "This matter will be escalated for review. Until then, no further changes can be made without oversight." Logan looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing me for the first time, not as someone quiet, not as someone easy to manage, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. And I realized something in that moment. I hadn't won by being louder. I hadn't won by convincing anyone. I'd won because I understood something he never bothered to learn. In systems built on rules, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be documented. And once it is, everything else starts to collapse on its own. After Logan's story collapsed in that office, I expected the next part to be simple, like the evidence would speak, the adults would nod, and the truth would neatly take its place. But real life doesn't wrap itself up that clean, because Logan didn't just lie once. He built his life on being believed, and when a person like that gets cornered, they don't suddenly become honest. They get strategic. Thomas told me we were placing a temporary lock on my travel file while the compliance office escalated the case. That meant no more edits, no more last-minute changes, no more quick fixes from someone's phone. It sounded final. It wasn't. That afternoon, my mother called again, not crying, not apologizing, not asking if I was okay. She asked Thomas if we could handle this privately. Thomas listened, then asked one question. "Do you deny that your son submitted an expired ID to restrict your minor child's clearance?" There was a pause on the line. Then my mother said, "I don't understand any of that. Logan handles the paperwork, and that sentence, in my family, had always been the end of it. In that office, it was the beginning. Thomas asked to speak to Logan directly. Logan's voice came on the line with the same smooth confidence he'd walked in with earlier. He tried to reframe everything. He said he was protecting me. He said there were concerns about my readiness. He said the hold was temporary, just until we sorted things out. Then he said something that made Thomas go quiet. He claimed he'd been advised, not by a friend, not by a random employee, by someone on the inside, meaning he wasn't just improvising anymore. He was trying to build cover. Thomas didn't argue. He ended the call and looked at me. "Do you have any record of conversations about your documents prior to this trip?" he asked. I almost said no, because my first instinct was always to minimize, to make myself small, to not create more trouble. But then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in months. A night, 3 years earlier. I was 11, sitting on the kitchen floor with a cheap laptop that barely held a charge. My grandmother had been sorting papers at the table, making piles the way she always did. Bills, medical, school, important. Logan had been pacing behind her, irritated, asking about a fund my dad had set up. Not in a greedy way, exactly. More like he was frustrated the world had rules he didn't control. "What's the point of it if I can't touch it?" he'd said. My grandmother didn't look up. "Because it's not for you to touch," she answered. He laughed like she was being dramatic, and then he said, under his breath, "She's the weak one. If I can keep her paperwork messy, she won't be able to do anything." He didn't know I was there, or maybe he did and assumed it wouldn't matter. But I remembered. I didn't record him. I didn't have some perfect cinematic proof. I was a kid on a cold kitchen floor, and my brain just saved it. Back then, I didn't even fully understand what he meant. I just knew the way he said it made me feel small. Thomas was still watching me, waiting. So I told him about that night. I told him the sentence, and I watched his face change, not into shock, but into recognition. He opened a folder and asked, "Did you ever mention this to anyone?" I wrote it down. I said, and it surprised me as much as it surprised him, because I had, after that night, I'd gone to my room, taken a sticky note, and written the sentence exactly as I remembered it. I didn't do it to be dramatic. I did it because something in me knew it mattered. Then I stuck it in the back of a blue folder my grandmother kept in the top drawer, the same folder I'd mentioned earlier. It was a small thing, a child's note, not a signed confession, not a legal document, not something that could win a case by itself. But Thomas nodded slowly. "Do you know if your grandmother still has that folder?" he asked. I swallowed. "Yes," I said. "She doesn't throw anything away." Thomas asked for her number. When my grandmother answered, her voice sounded like she'd been waiting for this call her whole life. Not because she wanted drama, because she knew Logan. Thomas explained who he was, then asked if she had a folder with records related to my identification updates, travel documentation, and any notes or written observations. My grandmother didn't hesitate. "I have it," she said. "And I have copies. Copies. Plural." Thomas asked her to email scanned images directly to the compliance office and to bring the originals to a local administrative branch the next morning. When the email came through, I watched Thomas open it. There were updated ID documents. Proof of the replacement issued weeks earlier, an email confirmation from the agency that Logan had ignored, and then, at the bottom, a photo of a sticky note. My handwriting, uneven and childish. One sentence. The one Logan thought nobody would remember. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just placed it into the file like the final piece of a puzzle. That shows intent, he said quietly. And that's the part people don't understand about evidence. Big evidence gets attention. Small evidence gets dismissed. But when you place small evidence inside a system that knows how patterns work, it becomes the difference between misunderstanding and plan. Logan's mistake wasn't only that he lied. It was that he forgot who he was dealing with. He forgot I was the kid who didn't talk back because talking back never worked. But I still heard everything, and I still remembered. What happened after that didn't look dramatic from the outside. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no moment where someone pointed and said, "You've been caught." The system doesn't work like that. It moves quietly. The first thing that happened was a pause. My travel file was officially frozen, not denied, not approved, just suspended. Locked in a state where nothing could move forward without review. That alone changed everything, because Logan had always relied on momentum, on things happening too fast for anyone to slow them down, on decisions being made in the rush of stress, exhaustion, and trust. Now there was no rush. Thomas explained it to me in simple terms. No one can make changes without oversight, he said. That includes your mother, I nodded. Even though I didn't fully understand what that meant yet, I would soon. Over the next few days, the phone calls started, not to me, to Thomas, to the compliance office, to anyone who would listen. Logan tried to escalate things. He questioned procedures. He asked for exceptions. He framed everything as a misunderstanding that just needed the right person to fix it. But every request he made created a paper trail, and paper trails have weight. The more he pushed, the more visible his actions became. The more visible they became, the less control he had. My mother called once more. This time, her voice sounded smaller. She didn't yell. She didn't defend Logan. She didn't accuse me. She asked what needed to happen to move past this. Thomas answered her carefully. "There's no moving past until the review is complete," he said. "Your daughter's documentation will remain protected until then." Protected. That word landed differently than all the others. Because no one had ever used it in reference to me before. A week later, a formal notice was issued. Logan was removed as an authorized handler of my records. No explanation, no public statement, just a line in a document that quietly stripped him of access. That was it. No punishment that looked satisfying from the outside. Just the loss of leverage. The thing he valued most. My mother didn't protest. She didn't fight the decision. She adjusted, which told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't shocked that Logan had done what he did. She was shocked it had consequences. As for me, I didn't feel victorious. There was no moment where I wanted to celebrate or confront anyone or say, "I told you so." I felt tired. The kind of tired that comes after your body finally realizes it's safe enough to stop holding itself together. That night, I stayed with my grandmother. I lay on a fold-out bed in her living room, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, uneven circles. For the first time in days, my chest didn't feel tight. I breathed, really breathed. Not shallow, not careful, just air in, air out. The next morning, Thomas called to check in. He told me the review would take time, weeks, maybe months, that there were processes in place now, and I wouldn't have to manage them. "That's not your job," he said. I thanked him, even though it felt inadequate. After the call ended, my grandmother poured coffee and sat across from me at the table. She didn't ask how I felt. She slid the blue folder toward me instead. Inside were copies of everything, organized, labeled, protected. "This is yours now," she said. I ran my fingers over the edges of the paper. It felt heavier than it looked. Not because it was important, but because it was mine. Life didn't magically become easy after that. The tension didn't vanish. My family didn't suddenly understand me. Logan didn't apologize. He didn't need to. He no longer had the power to decide anything about my life. And that was enough. A few weeks later, I walked into a different building with my grandmother beside me and my documents in my own bag. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. No one told me to step aside. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not because someone finally chose me, but because the system had been forced to see me, and I realized something then. Justice doesn't always feel like a win. Sometimes it just feels like quiet, like standing in a room where nothing is being taken from you anymore, like having space to breathe without waiting for the next thing to go wrong. That was the moment I understood what had really changed. Not my family, not the past, just the balance of power. And once that shifted, it didn't need noise to hold its place. It simply stayed. 3 months after the airport, my mother showed up at my grandmother's house. Not with flowers, not with a long apology speech. Just her, standing on the porch like someone waiting for the door to open before she decided what emotion to wear. I was in the kitchen when my grandmother called my name. "Evelyn," she said, and her voice was steady. "Your mother's here." My stomach tightened the same way it always did when I heard that word. Mother. Because in my head, it wasn't just a person. It was a role, a promise, a place you're supposed to be safe. And I'd learned the hard way that roles don't always do what they're supposed to do. I walked into the living room and saw her through the window before I opened the door. She looked tired, not broken, not ruined, just tired in the way people get when life stops obeying them. My grandmother opened the door first. My mother stepped inside, glanced at me, then looked away like holding eye contact would force her to feel something she wasn't ready for. She sat down without being invited. That was always her way, moving like she still belonged in every room I stood in. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then she said it. "I didn't know." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" Not even, "I was wrong." Just, "I didn't know." I watched her hands twist together in her lap. I watched her swallow hard like she was trying to convince herself she was the victim of confusion instead of the author of a choice. And I understood something in that moment that I'd never been able to put into words before. My mother wasn't cruel in the dramatic way. She was comfortable believing the version of reality that required the least discomfort from her. When Logan spoke, he gave her an easy path, a simple story, a way to avoid conflict, a way to avoid admitting she'd raised someone capable of doing something unforgivable. So she took it. That was her pattern, not evil, just convenient. She looked at me then, finally. Her eyes were glossy, like she'd practiced looking regretful in the mirror. like she'd rehearsed what a devastated mother should look like. "I thought you were being difficult," she said. "Logan said you wanted attention. He said you were acting out." Acting out. I almost laughed, because what 14-year-old acts out by quietly standing in an airport with no ID and no food and no one coming back for them? But I didn't laugh. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy to perform pain for someone who hadn't protected me when it mattered. I just said, "You didn't check." Her face tightened, like the simplicity of that sentence hit her harder than any insult would have. "I trusted him," she whispered. And there it was again. Trust. Like trust was a reason. Like trust was a shield. I looked at my grandmother's coffee table, at the blue folder sitting neatly on top, at the papers inside that had done what my voice never could. Then I looked back at my mother. "I know you trusted him," I said. "That's what hurt." My mother started crying then, quietly, wiping at her face like she was embarrassed by her own tears. "I'm your mother," she said, and her voice cracked. "I'm supposed to..." "You're supposed to protect me," I finished in my head, but she didn't. And here's the thing I learned that year: people will say I'm supposed to when the consequences finally show up. They say it when it's safe. They don't always say it when it's true. My mother reached for my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't reach back either, because I wasn't angry in the way she expected. I wasn't there to punish her. I was there to stay standing. She looked at my grandmother, then back at me. "Can we fix this?" she asked. That question sounds innocent until you've lived inside it, because fix this in my family never meant accountability. It meant returning to normal, returning to the version of life where I stayed quiet. Logan stayed trusted, and my mother stayed comfortable. So I answered honestly, "I don't know," I said, "but I know what I'm not doing anymore." She frowned slightly, like she didn't understand. I took a breath. "I'm not covering for him," I said. "I'm not pretending it didn't happen. I'm not being quiet so you can feel okay." My mother stared at me like she was meeting a stranger. And maybe she was, because the daughter she'd raised, the one who didn't make trouble, the one who swallowed her feelings, the one who made herself easy, was gone. Not because I hated her, because I couldn't survive being that person anymore. My mother's voice got sharper for a second, without meaning to. "So what? You're cutting me off," she asked, like that was the only language she knew. Extremes, either or, control or chaos. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I'm setting rules. That's a line most people aren't taught to say to their parents, but it's a line some kids have to learn to survive." My mother blinked. "What rules?" she asked, and I told her. If she wanted contact, it would happen through my grandmother at first. No private conversations where Logan could rewrite my words later. No requests for documents. No control over my records. No, "I need you to sign this" moments. And most importantly, no pretending. My mother listened, and I could see the fight in her face. Not the fight to save me, the fight to save her image of herself. But something else was happening too. She was realizing she couldn't bargain her way back into control. She couldn't cry her way out of consequences. She couldn't say I didn't know and expect that to be enough. Not anymore. When she left that day, she didn't slam the door. She didn't make a scene. She walked down the porch steps slowly, like someone carrying a weight they finally had to admit was theirs. I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, you know how rare that is, because forgiveness is not the same as access. Understanding is not the same as inviting someone back into the space where they can hurt you again. I can understand my mother's weakness. I can even grieve it. But I don't have to sacrifice myself to make it easier for her to live with it. Not everyone needs to be forgiven, but everyone needs to be protected. And for the first time in my life, I understood that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was adulthood. If you're still here, I want to talk to you for a second, not as a character, but as a person. Because I know what this story can feel like to watch. You're listening, and maybe you're angry for me. Maybe you're thinking, how could a mother do that? Or maybe you're quieter than that. Maybe you're thinking about your own life, about the times you were the one who didn't make trouble, the one who stayed calm so everyone else could stay comfortable, the one who swallowed your side of the story because you already knew how it would end. And if that's you, I need you to hear this. Being overlooked doesn't mean you're insignificant. It means you've been living in a system that benefits from your silence for a long time. I thought power looked like confidence, like the person who talked the most, like the person who could walk into a room and control the story. But that airport taught me something different. Real power is quieter than that. It's the ability to hold on to facts when someone else is trying to rewrite reality. It's the ability to document what happened when everyone else is asking you to just let it go. It's the ability to understand the rules of the game because feelings don't protect you when people decide you're inconvenient. And here's the part that changed everything for me. I didn't survive because I got lucky. I survived because the things I'd been doing, quietly remembering, observing, keeping track, finally met the right moment and the right system. That's the truth. Nobody tells the invisible kid. Your silence might be hiding skills you don't even realize you have. Your patience might be training you. Your attention to detail might be your protection. Your ability to stay calm might be the reason you'll outlast the people who only know how to dominate. So if you've ever been made to feel small, if you've ever been treated like your voice doesn't matter, if you've ever watched someone else get believed just because they sound confident, I want you to take one thing from my story. Stop measuring your worth by how loudly you can fight. Measure it by how clearly you can see. Because the day you finally choose yourself, the day you stop begging to be understood and start protecting what's true, that's the day the balance shifts. Not with a bang, with a decision. And you don't have to announce it to anyone for it to be real. Just start acting like your life belongs to you, even in small ways, even quietly, especially quietly.